Afro-American militancy. Tonight's biographies are Hubert Henry Harrison and Samuel A. Haynes, two men active in the 1920s and particularly involved in and around the Garvey movement. The years of World War I and the early 1920s abounded in outspoken, individualistic, and often overly intellectual black socialists. The usual account of these men lumps all together under the label of radicals. A good many socialists appear far from radical when studied in detail. The archetype of the less-than-radical radical was Hubert Henry Harrison, lecturer, literary critic, newspaper editor, and virtually self-educated master of innumerable fields of study. Born in St. Croix, Virgin Islands in 1883, Harrison had only a grade school education in the Danish schools of the islands. Upon coming to the United States, he worked in the post office in New York from 1907 to 1911, during which time he published a few book reviews for the New York Times. Around 1912, he became involved with the Max Eastman, John Reed campus crowd of radicals of Harvard. Harrison was one of the editors of the old Masses magazine. It seems Harrison turned to socialism after being fired from his government job subsequent to expressing strong criticism of Booker T. Washington. Washington had certain powers in politics and over civil service at this time. During World War I, Harrison founded in Harlem a Liberty League for Afro-Americans. It was a pacifist organization connected with the Socialist Party. He published a few issues of a small magazine, The Voice, as a sounding board for his Liberty League. It was radical enough as a magazine to qualify for the Attorney General's report on sedition in the Negro press. The pacifist socialist Harrison was highly critical of black middle-class snobbery in the NAACP, and he nicknamed that organization the National Association for the Advancement of Certain People. It was Harrison who gave Marcus Garvey a start in Harlem. Garvey had been in the States about a year and had gone unnoticed until the night in August of 1917 when Harrison chose to personally introduce the fiery Jamaican to a meeting of several thousand Harlemites. The meeting had been called to recruit members into the Liberty League, and Garvey spoke with passion and eloquence in behalf of the man who introduced him. However, Garvey was not about to play second fiddle in someone else's organization. He took his success with the crowd as evidence of an ability to rally black people to his own cause. Soon Garvey's UNIA had overshadowed the Liberty League and all other organizations in Harlem. Harrison himself became a Garvey supporter and an editor of the Negro World. As Harrison explained to a white friend, he had a similar Pan-Africanist radicalism. Hubert Harrison was something of a statesman for racial unity. In his capacity as an authority on African history and culture, he was able to bridge the gap and maintain respect of both nationalists and socialists, both Garveyites and integrationists. In the 1920 split between Garveyites and socialists, it was Harrison who called a secret meeting in Greenwich Village to get together leading leftists of Harlem for a discussion of ways of turning the UNIA toward socialism. And apparently this secret meeting was unconclusive. Not only would bitterness soon increase between Garvey and the left, but many socialists present at the village confab would soon fall out among themselves, dividing into radical and moderate factions. Harrison turned his interest then to scholarly pursuits, stopped his work on the Negro World late in 1921. Harrison, working with Arthur Schomburg, amassed the Negro collection for the Harlem Public Library, which has become one of the world's most important depositories of source material on the Negro. Harrison donated much of his own extensive library to the Schomburg collection. The key to understanding Harrison is in his non-political activities. Notwithstanding his ties to the Socialist Party, with left journals The Masses, The New Republic, and with the mass-based UNIA of Garvey, Harrison was by no means a professional radical. In the period before World War I, he was instructor of English and economics at the Harlem School of Social Science, professor of comparative religion at the Modern School, and after the war, professor of embryology at the Cosmopolitan College of Chiropractic. He belonged to a number of civic organizations and was a member of the Elks. Throughout the 1920s, he was staff lecturer for the New York Board of Education, expounding on such subjects as the literary lights of yesterday and today. He was for some years a lecturer at NYU, giving a course in contemporary civilization. His writings consist largely of literary criticism in both left journals and mainstream publications, such as the Christian Science Monitor. His reputation in Harlem, however, was not for literary criticism or embryology, but for his great knowledge on the Negro and ancient African history. He was remembered by his contemporary Richard B. Moore as having been Harlem's most influential popularizer of the glories of Negro past. Cyril Briggs, of the African Blood Brotherhood, the leftist offshoot of Garveyites, once titled Harrison the founder and first professor of Street Corner University, referring to Harrison's speeches on the street corners of Harlem. His oratorical disquisitions on history were in addition to one theoretical and historical work, When Africa Awakes, published in 1920. As seen in the chapter headings, it was concerned with, quote, our international consciousness, the new politics, the new race consciousness, the problem of leadership, and it concluded that what the Negro needed was knowledge of a wider world and of the long past. Harrison was one of the few Negro intellectuals to work with Garveyites. He remained as an editor of the Negro World, as mentioned, on into 1921. The Socialist Messenger magazine offered an explanation for his ties with Garvey. According to staff writer Floyd Calvin, Harrison worked with the UNIA because he had been an egotistical pontificator more concerned with having a large audience than with the issue of whose platform he was speaking from. This seems valid in part. Probably more important, Harrison was from the West Indies. The easy acceptance of an all-black organization was a distinguishing factor between West Indian and American Negroes. In addition, the roundish, spectacled Harrison was quite dark of color, something of a requirement for being a Garveyite. Most American Negro intellectuals were too light-skinned to pass this test. Samuel A. Haynes. One of the more tenacious supporters of Garveyism was Samuel A. Haynes. An immigrant from the West Indies, he settled in Pittsburgh in the early 20s and was a leader of the powerful UNIA chapter in that city. In 1921, he held the post of registrar in the UNIA International. For a decade, his columns on race relations were a regular feature of the Negro world. During the 1940s, he wrote for The African, a journal which had among its contributors George Padmore, Marcus Garvey's widow, a number of other former Garveyites, and W.E.B. Du Bois. Haynes had his political awakening during World War I. As a youth of 18, he joined the army and went abroad to fight in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Upon returning to the West Indies, he was involved in a mutiny of black troops. At one point, the blacks were about to slaughter a captive group of white soldiers and were stopped by the restraining influences of Haynes, a move which earned him the grateful thanks of British authorities. In later years, he would proudly recall his efforts in behalf of the white soldiers and consider it evidence of his sense of fairness and justice for peoples of all races. Now, as a Negro World columnist, as a Garveyite columnist, Haynes was noted for his anti-white venom. Strong opinion was mixed with news on lynchings and other barbarities of white America. Reports on economic problems and international affairs also appeared with regularity in Haynes's writings. After Garvey's expulsion of the socialists from his movement in 1920 and 21, the Garvey newspaper Negro World lost much of its emphasis on economic problems, and it was Haynes who helped to retain some of the early flavor through his coverage of anti-colonial demonstrations and labor strikes in the West Indies, etc. In a column of 1929, he saw fit to defend Du Bois and the Pan-African Congresses from attacks in the Negro press. To accusations that the Pan-African movement was a distraction from the central fight for justice in the United States, Haynes replied that Du Bois's efforts were but part of a growing awareness that freedom for the Negro in America was intimately tied to African liberation, and the Pan-African Congress was in league with the UNIA, the West African Students' Union, the African National Congress, and other movements for African redemption. At the time of this editorial, Marcus Garvey had by no means reconciled his differences with Du Bois. That a Negro World columnist would write in a conciliatory vein was but one case among many of a Garveyite who was not in full accord with the views of the leader concerning this historic feud between Du Bois and Garvey. Haynes' strong criticism of white injustice got him embroiled in an editorial battle with George Schuyler of the Pittsburgh Courier, the latter labeling the former a black Ku Klux Klanner. Haynes replied, "I fully understand Mr. Schuyler's position and sympathize with him. However, I don't believe in hypocrisy in deceit between the races." In Haynes' view, it was hypocrisy to deny the Negro his share of world power. Africa should be for the black man, Asia for the Asians, the white man for Europe and America, and if this is Ku Klux Klanism, then make the best of it, said Haynes. Schuyler was called to task for his contention that progress was the result of cooperation. The Courier columnist had used as examples the Civil War to end slavery in America and the Belgian government investigation of atrocities in the Congo. Haynes retorted that in any cooperation involving these cases, it was not because of sympathy for the black, but rather it was done, in the case of the Congo in particular, out of fear of open rebellion in the Belgian Congo. The rebuttal to Schuyler, as you might note, is blunt and rather morally cool. This was the basis of Haynes' support for the UNIA. Whereas many a Garveyite held to a personal worship of the leader, Haynes believed in the UNIA as a practical necessity. When Garvey was jailed in 1925 and many members were leaving the leaderless movement, Haynes was one of 4 leading association officials who staged an emergency convention in Detroit to attempt to rally supporters to the cause. In the early 30s, Haynes was thoroughly disheartened when Garveyites by the thousands switched to Father Divine and Daddy Grace. To Haynes, those that sought a reincarnation of Marcus Garvey and some religious evangelist were an insult to the race and the practical approach to freedom through power, which was the UNIA.